Have a special guest today that I'm super excited is able to join us because he's got firsthand experience with disciple making movements, as well as being a church planter and church leader in North America. So I'd like to welcome Kenneth Shackelford. Kenneth, can you tell us just a little bit about your background?
I was blessed to be in ministry full time, straight out of college. Was in California mostly during that time for almost 10 years in the San Francisco Bay Area. And then more recently, I was blessed to be a part of a church plant in Northwest Arkansas that started with 5 families, and God just poured his blessings on us. We grew in all sorts of ways, obviously numerically, and we would say we were doing ministry by the seat of God's pants. We were just hanging on for the ride because we didn't have any grand strategy necessarily, other than just trying to love on people and trying to be relevant. Part of the ways that God blessed the church was to give it a heart for the nations. We definitely had a heart for discipleship, although I would have said something like Discipleship.org back then would have been a huge blessing for me, because I had not necessarily been intentionally discipled, and I didn't have that model very much, but we certainly were trying just to follow Jesus and love on people and share his word and be real and relevant, and be a big part of what we wanted to be about was prayer. So that certainly helped, because God made up for a lot of mistakes. Another way we were trying to be relevant was to be transparent, sometimes brutally so, and almost shockingly for some of the people that started coming into our church, how transparent we were being. So those were some parts of discipleship that God blessed. But one of the ways he blessed it was to give us a heart for the nations, for all peoples, in a very surprising way. I was born an MK, missionary kid, and I knew being focused on the nations was important, but it was always for me kind of a part of the church, kind of segmented, and we were so busy with so many things happening that it had really gotten segmented. But it started growing, and part of that was God giving my wife and I a very surprising calling, but very crystal clear calling to hand off the leadership of the church. We had grown from those few families to close to 1,000 in about 5 years. So we were getting starting to get that mega church feel. We didn't own a building. They still don't, even though there are a few thousand now. But that was surprising to us, because that was really my ministry dream come true. It was in my sweet spot. But we were blessed to go and serve in Central Asia, very remote location. You can see what it looked like. And we went with some fairly traditional models of reaching out, crossing cultural boundaries, trying to make sure what they understood from the gospel really matched the truth, but also match what they could comprehend in their culture, those types of things. Up to that point, I'd never really been exposed to disciple making movements. While we were there, I started getting more and more exposed to what God was doing in very powerful ways from multiple different streams of backgrounds, including, within the country we were in that was very repressive, very oppressed as far as any kind of Christianity goes. For decades, the church had exploded in that persecution, and it was all about discipleship. And so learning from them, and then being exposed to, while I was in Thailand at a conference, spent a week with a guy named Wolfgang Simpson, who wrote Houses That Changed the World. And he, I think, joined George Barna and wrote the House Church book. This very gruff, no nonsense German man, spending a week with him and him telling incredible stories of just very simply making disciples and immediately training them to make disciples and having that expectation, but keeping it simple, and the power of multiplication. It blew me away. I felt like I had sat at it was like sitting at the feet of Paul and just hearing story after story after story of what God could do. And I'd never heard that the book of Acts was happening right now in very surprising places around the world. So after our time in China, we were there. We were involved in the project for about 6 years, but there probably less than, around 4 years. We came back, and then I continued to get some exposure to disciple making, and went to a conference that was led by Neil Cole, and that was really powerful. But all of that I loved, but it didn't seem to fit me and my passions and giftings and desire to see congregational churches form and that type of thing. And so God was really doing a work on me. When we decided to go back to the field, this time to Albania, our younger children were older now. Our 3 children that were on the field with us before, they were teenagers. My oldest daughter was in college, but we talked her into dropping out to go on the mission field with us, because that's the kind of parents we are, right? So she finished college later, but we went to a training together. It rocked our world because it made discipleship, it made the idea of being a disciple maker so accessible to all of us. It totally demystified this idea of what it means to make disciples. It was incredibly empowering because it was so simple. And so it was so amazing to go to Albania as a family and see our teenage kids just being disciple making machines. They all made disciples. They all started small church groups. I mean, it was really, really fun to do that as a family. And for me, it was humbling, but at the same time exciting. Humbling in that it really had to strip away some of the things that I wanted to hold on to as a trained Christian minister, right? And not that those things were bad, and I still put them to use often. I love getting in front of large groups of people and preaching and doing expository preaching from the word and that type of thing. But that simplification meant I just needed to give up some things and give it to God and let him do some of the work, the burdens that I'd placed on myself. He did. The Spirit can do so much better. So really trusting the Holy Spirit and seeing him work. And so since then, I finally just said, okay, God, I get it. It's about disciple making. And that is where the rubber meets the road. And that is where we can truly begin to see God work the way he intended to, when we see the simple model that Jesus put before us. So since then, I've been pretty much dedicated to trying to help connect believers to their co-mission with Jesus. That's often called the Great Commission, but that co-mission being to make disciples. And very simply, when people respond to that, baptizing them and then teaching them, but not just teaching them, right? Teaching them to obey. And so that's been part of our journey, and we've been blessed to kind of be on this adventure. And I just feel like I'm learning more about this. You would think after 3 decades of full-time ministry, I'd pretty much be settled into what I know it's about. But, just 2 days ago, I was listening to your latest podcast with Scotty Kessler, and and I felt like I was just drinking it in all over again.
Well, Kenneth, the great thing about disciple making is that nobody ever arrives, so we're always able to keep learning.
Absolutely.
When I a couple of years ago, I talked to Robert Coleman, who was then 90 years of age and had literally been discipling people, since he was in his mid 20s. Like in his Bible, he has a list of all the people he disciples every year. And
Right.
when Robert Coleman turned to me and said, I'm just learning every day about
Yeah.
making disciples. I
Well,
thought, Robert Coleman says that, that's good, because
Absolutely.
that's how I feel too.
Yeah, and I was blessed before Albania. One of our trainers who'd come for 1 week out of the 3-week training we were part of was George Patterson. He was in his late 80s, and some people kind of refer to him as the father of modern church planting movements, because he started putting some of these into practice back in the 50s, and it was so amazing to see this elderly gentleman, and he ended up being my mentor and coach while I was in Albania. We would talk almost weekly, and we'd Skype back and forth into his 90s, and he still had so much energy and so much enthusiasm and such a desire, such a heart, even for Albanians, to want to see this happen there. And he was asking me tons of questions and really wanted to learn what are the barriers there, and just to have that heart to be humble, to learn and want to be led by the Spirit is a powerful ingredient for kingdom movements, for sure.
Let me put on the screen a definition. This is a more simple definition than you often find, but let me put it up there. A disciple-making movement exists when disciple-making disciples plant at least 100 churches that plant churches at least 4 generations deep in multiple streams within a few short years. Yeah. Just reflect real quick on this definition.
When you're talking about 4 generations, multiple streams, obviously 100 churches. Of course, we're not talking about 100 churches that have 100 members. Typically, a movement, they don't usually land on a specific number, but they're typically at least 1,000 new believers within a fairly short period of time. And you start seeing new generations happening at that point about every 18 months to 2 years. And of course, a new generation means typically a doubling at least, if not more. The power is that by the time you get to 4 generations, it's kind of like us, and we'll talk about this next week as well, but we know our grandparents, and we may know the name of our great-grandparents, but you start getting into great-greats, and I think I saw a picture of them. That's our family, right? That's our blood family. And it's the same way when you get down to the 4th generation. It's a self-sustaining, and it's obviously been built into the system, in that those that are a part of that, they have these expectations that being a part of this, being a follower of Jesus, this is what you do. This is normal Christianity. It's not just something we're trying to reach out and grasp somehow that seems elusive. This is just part of their DNA.
Here's what we're going to do. We're going to show you a presentation that gives real specific examples of disciple-making movements. The presentation was made by David Young, who went to West Africa to be with Shadonke Johnson. So this is an exploration of Shadonke Johnson, the disciple-making movement in Sierra Leone that's literally transformed the country. And David does a great job explaining with pictures and specific examples what happens in a movement. So notice he'll talk about multiple generations of disciple-making disciples. He'll talk about how everybody sees themselves as a disciple who makes disciples. And then he'll just show you how broad spread it is. So let's join together and watch it now.
I'm here to talk about vision. 2 things I want to say first. Look at me. I'm 58, I'm balding, my stomach's hanging over my belt. I'm wearing khakis and a blue shirt. So I want to say to the youth pastors who are here and like you church planners that got these like big epic beards and the lead pastors with your skinny jeans, whatever your vision is, this is your destiny. And I hope I'm here to see it. Yeah, all that stuff's gone. And the second thing is this. For like 30 years, I was a traditional minister in a traditional church that's 70-something years old. It was like some of the best years of my life. And I love my church. They honored me. It was an honor to do ministry there. But then, like about 7 years ago, I just kind of went through a personal crisis, which has involved a lot of things. One of them was when my son said they didn't believe in God anymore. And so I went to the elders and I said, you know what? Let me go away. I got to rethink this whole thing. So I went away on a retreat, and here's what I prayed. Really now I think it was rather foolish. I said, Lord, what is your vision for me and for North Boulevard, my church? What's your vision? And like somewhere halfway through that little retreat, I kind of got this response, hey, idiot, like, why do I got to tell you this? You didn't read this? It's like been in the scriptures for 2,000 years. You really need me to tell you? I'm being serious here. Like, it came down to this. Your vision is go make disciples of all nations. That's it. Like, I'm not going to give you anything else. I don't get a private contract with God. We negotiate some special deal. My church is not like yours. We have a special deal. Instead, I get the vision that he gave me. His vision is go make disciples of all nations. In fact, he kind of put it to me this way. He said, you know that little deal where you've all heard the story about you can't save every starfish, but I saved that one? He said to me, stop talking like that. I didn't tell you to go save one starfish. I said go make disciples of all nations, and you can do it. The only way you won't do it is if you walk by sight. Because walking by sight, there's no way to do it. And North Americans are specialists at walking by sight. So when we hear like a guy like Shadonke Johnson speak, Shadonke Johnson says this yesterday. He's been coaching our church, and he's talking to us, and he says, I said to everybody, hey, you need to go to Sierra Leone because when you go, it'll change everything. And Shadonke just somewhat sheepishly says to me, yeah, it's really important for Americans to see it because y'all walk by sight. Now, he can say that to me because he's bigger than I am and a lot of other things too. But what if you walk by faith? Like, what if when Jesus says, go make disciples of all nations, what if that's actually possible to people who care about it? So this is what happened. I came back and I said to the elders, like, here's the deal. I want to lead North Boulevard, and I want to lead it however God, whatever y'all are willing to do. But the rest of my life is about one thing till the day I die. I'm pushing every poker chip I have in the middle of the table. I'm walking up to the edge of the cliff. I don't care if there's a rope or not. I'm jumping. I'm going to do my best to make disciples of all nations come hell or high water. That's what I'm going to do. That's it. For me, that's it. I had no idea what I was doing. I'd never heard of Bobby Harrington. I remember going to an exponential conference. First time it was like 5,000 church planners and disciple makers, and Jim Putman was speaking. And every word he said, I thought to myself, I thought I was pretty smart till he said that. Everything he said was like, I didn't even know you could do this. And then we got up and said, let's just plant 60,000 churches. Why not? And, inside, I'll tell you what I thought inside. What I thought inside was, I know we'll never do it, and we'll end up looking like idiots, but it'll inspire the church. And, they'll think that we know what we're doing. We tried to raise $1.6 million that very year to start a church planting movement. Instead of $1.6 million, look, we opened up the envelopes. We had wedding rings, property. People were giving percentage of their businesses. We raised $6.1 million for church planting. All of a sudden, when we cast a vision, here's what I discovered. When you say, I'm going to walk by faith, I can't do this, but God, if you're willing to. So all of a sudden, all these resources, I'm not joking, signs, wonders, and powers, blood and fire and billows of smoke. That's my new text. They started happening all around us. Like, no kidding. We used to talk about are miracles possible? That's hilarious. Like, they happen all the time at my church. I'm not making, that's like all the time. Like, it's kind of boring, really. It's like, yeah. We had a kid, he's like 16 years old, and he hears about a children's home over in Tanzania, and they need $50,000 or something like this. So he gives $20. He goes to our youth minister, who's sitting back here somewhere. He says, can I make an announcement? The youth minister says, yeah, and whatever you raise, I'll add $500 to it. Then some family says, well, if he gets $5, we'll give $5. Another family says, we'll give $5. Someone else comes along and they say, hey, we'll match it, whatever you raise. Then some corporation calls. My wife just got back from Tanzania 2 weeks ago, where she handed a check from $20. She handed him a check for $110,000. $110,000. So here's my thing. You don't have to call that a sign of wonder and power. If you don't want to call it a miracle, it doesn't matter to me. I don't care. But if you are a woman living in Tanzania and you can't make milk for your baby because you are so poor, and you pray, dear Lord, will you bring me some milk, and $110,000 worth of formula shows up, that's a pretty good miracle. It just happens all the time. Once you step out in faith, God starts to act. Actually, not only God, but demons start to act too. They expose themselves. Because they're all in your church. Like you know that, don't you? They're all in your church. Your members, they're full of demons. But the demons in your church are smart, and they're smarter than you are. They're smart enough to know not to show themselves. Once you step out by faith, not only does God show himself, but the demons start showing themselves too. Because now we're full on. There's going to be a fight now. When you step out in faith, God starts sending you resources. I got to tell you this is like super cool. I just saw him walk in, and I don't see him now. The lights are in my eyes, but Jerry Trousdale just walked in. Are you out there, Jerry? Did I see you? I didn't make that up, did I? Well, maybe it's like a dream or something, a vision. I thought I saw him, and anyway, okay, whatever. So Jerry Trousdale is like one of the grandfathers of disciple-making movements. Now, if you don't know about a disciple-making movement, you're going to get a snapshot in just a second. Jerry's living in Murfreesboro. He was a vice president for Thomas Nelson. He wasn't in my fellowship. Who are we? But when he heard that we announced 60,000 churches, he came and visited my church. He walks in one day. I said, Jerry, I knew him because I'd insulted him years ago when I said something about the New King James translation. I hope he doesn't remember that. He's not here, so I think I'm safe. He shows up. I said, what are you doing? He says, I don't really know. And I said, I know. You're here to help us plant 60,000 churches. So Jerry comes to me, and he says to me, meets with me, he says, it's not as hard as you think it is. And I was thinking, well, I didn't really think it was hard. I thought it was impossible. He said, no, seriously, it can be done. He belongs to New Generations. He's a senior staff member for New Generations. And he says to me, New Generations has just finished planting its 59,000th church in 15 years. No kidding. And he tells me about this guy, Shadonke. So Shadonke spoke this morning like I'm not sure you realize. Shadonke Johnson's movement has baptized more Muslims in the last 15 years than have been baptized in the last 15 centuries combined times 10. They've baptized 1.5 million people. They have planned. I met with New Generations, like their senior team met. They actually met in Murfreesboro, which is a real honor for us, my hometown, where I live now. I met with them. They're putting up on the wall all their stats of what they think is going to happen in 2020. This isn't like dream. These aren't dreams. This is statistically, this is what's probably going to happen because this is what happened last year. 9,000 churches they think they're going to plant this year in 2020. 9,000 churches. And I have it on my phone, I took a picture, but like some crazy number of baptisms, and some guy in the back raises his hand and says, no. My region's not 4,000, it's 40,000 baptisms. And they're like, 40,000. Like, when's the last time your church made that kind of mistake? Oh, no, it wasn't 4,000, it's 40,000. Yeah, okay, somebody change that number. Jerry Trousdale comes and places membership at my church. And all of a sudden, Shadonke Johnson's coaching me in my church. So here's the thing I say to Shadonke, what are you doing? Everybody asks the question, what are you doing? And his answer is, we walk by faith. Y'all walk by sight. We pray for it. We beg God for it. When he answers, we do it. It's that simple. We pray for it. We beg for it. When he answers, we do it. And everybody in Sierra Leone and all across sub-Saharan Africa, every single one of them has the audacity not only to make disciples, like they don't know you don't have to. They should never visit America, ever. Because if they come here, they'll learn you don't have to do anything. You just have to sit there. That's all you got to do. I'll give it to you. You sit there, drop $5 in, done deal. And not only do they all think you have to make disciples, they think you're supposed to plant churches. Everybody you run into plants churches. So let me just give you a quick tour here. I have permission to share these. I've changed the names. Roger has overseen the planning of, I just like every time I met a church planter, I'm there, I just took a picture of me standing next to, not every time because there were a lot more. And you see, I've gotten even more pudgy since that picture. Here's our driver, Mahmoud. Mahmoud, this guy is a church planter who does all the driving. He's planted 2 churches. He picks us up at the airport. I said to him, hey, have you planted any churches? He said, oh yeah, I'm a church planter who happens to drive. That's how he casts himself. I can't show his picture. This guy, 3 different times, has gone into Boko Haram territory in Nigeria, where he has planted churches among the most extreme terrorists in all of Africa. They've got 300 martyrs in their church. You heard that, didn't you? So our elders have said, we're all in. We've got a plan. We're God willing, next year, we're launching 16 disciple-making movements from North Boulevard. And one of the first things we had to reckon with is, are we okay knowing that we're going to have martyrs? This guy his first trip to Boko Haram, the guys that traveled with him were murdered. He came back and his church said, don't go back. So he sneaked back because he can't stand the thought of lost people in Nigeria. By the way, it just keeps going. Here's the university president. You know what he is? He's a disciple-making church planter who happens to be a university president. This guy is a disciple-making church planter who happens to be the DJ at the local radio station. These 3 soccer coaches are disciple-making church planters. They won the award for planting the most churches. They got to go to the Mega Fest, which has 3,000 people show up. You know how many churches you have to have planted before you're allowed to go to Mega Fest? You can't even go if you haven't planted 5 churches. And 3,000 people will show up. Here's a church planter who happens to be a dentist. His job's easy because he puts you in the chair, he opens your mouth, puts a thing in there, you can't do anything, and he baptizes you at the end of the day. No kidding. This worship leader has discipled more than 1,000 people. This woman, she is a disciple maker church planter who happens to be a CPA for one of the churches. Aliyah is leading a DBS with a Muslim crowd. One of the guys in this stands up at the end. Jerry tells me it takes you 2 DBSs when you do it right before they're baptized. This guy stands up after his very first one and he says, I like this Jesus, I'll be back. He's baptized the next week. Daniel's a zone leader. He's overseeing the planting of hundreds of churches. The brother kneeling, if I could tell you a story, he came in with a suicide bomb to blow up the church. Someone beats him at the door, wraps their arms around him, loves him, does a DBS with him. He's now planted 10 churches. I'm not showing his face because he lives in a dangerous world. This is what they're doing. Here are 11 generations of believers at a church that's 3 years old. This woman brought this woman, who brought this woman, who brought this woman, 11 generations. Uma's leading a DBS among animists. There's John King, by the way, who designed DBS as you know it. When I asked who planted this church, every one of these guys came walking up. I planted it. They probably didn't understand me very well. Here's Shaka, who's 19 years old. He just planted his first church. Jacob has planted 2 churches. This woman has planted a church that, her name is Ruth. She has 250 members in her church. Edward is the zone leader. They can't count how many churches he's planted. Judah only plants churches where there are no roads. He's a specialist. I'm not making this up. None of this. 10 churches where there are no roads. Haji is blind, and he's planted 2 churches. To my right, Jamil's planted 5 churches. To my left, Ahmed, he's planted 1 church. Steve is a church planter who's a contractor. Everywhere he goes to build houses, he plants a church. He's planted 5 churches. Naila, age 57, my age when I took that picture, planted 10 churches. Isaiah planted this church. This little girl's 3 months old. She's already planted 3 churches. She's serious. Look how serious she is. She's got the gospel, man. 8 generations of believers at this church. This, by the way, this is Santa. That's That's Shadonke's wife, leading a DBS. Maria has planted a church. The university campus planners have done 5 churches. Isa is a blind former imam, a sheikh. He loses his sight. His village throws him out of the church. What do you call a Muslim church? Thank you, the mosque. You think I didn't know that? I probably didn't. They threw him out because they thought he's being punished because he's gone blind. He goes, these Christians come up to him and say, hey, let us pray over you. He finally comes to know Jesus, but he can do nothing because he's blind. So he sits and he prays. People come up and say, will you pray for me? And miracles start to happen. Next thing you know, a church forms. And he says, that wasn't all that hard. So he gives the guy $5 and he says, take me to the next village. God takes him, he's blind, he sits under a tree, he starts praying, all these Muslims come to him, he starts praying, miracles start happening, he plants a second church. By the time I met this guy, he had already planted, what do I say, there are 9 churches, and he told me this was in November. He said, I think I got 2 more in me before the end of the year. I'm just saying, you're thinking to yourself, there's no way this can happen. You're thinking, my vision is to, find a deacon capable of doing our pencil sharpening ministry. Good luck. I'm just telling you, you can reach the whole world if you walk by faith. Edward's a national comedian. He does the night show there. He's planted 2 churches. This guy left let's keep going. Boom, boom, boom. I'm not making any of this up. We're leaving the country. And there's a team of like 8 or 9 of us from Murfreesboro. We're coming out. It's like when 8 big, white people show up at the international airport in Bow, it gets attention. So the head of security walks up to us to find out what we're doing. We say, we've been in there. We were with a guy named Shadonke Johnson. He goes, oh, Shadonke, I know Shadonke. He baptized me. I planted a church. He takes me back. This is the head of security at the international airport. He takes me back. There's a picture of Shadonke Johnson sitting on his desk. He introduces me to all the security. He's baptized all of them. Okay. The clock says I'm 2 minutes over. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. And this little guy right here, that is the happiest little boy you'll ever see. You know why he's happy? Because he's growing up where people have decided, I don't have to come up with my own vision because God already gave me a vision. He made it really clear. His final command ought to be your first priority. Go make disciples of all nations. If you think it can't be done, you're walking by sight, because your God is an awesome God. You may just not know it. Thanks.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that presentation by David Young as much as I do.
If you didn't enjoy it, you need to check your pulse.
So Kenneth, when you watch that video, what stands out to you as some of the important things that North Americans need to realize about these disciple-making movements?
I think one of the most important is that it's extremely biblical. I mean, the way they're doing things is what you read in the book of Acts, and it's what you hear Paul referring to through his letters, and 2 Timothy 2:2, when he's talking to Timothy, he's basically speaking out for generations, the things you've heard me say among many others. So it's not just Timothy, there's multiple streams. Entrust this to trustworthy men who can also teach others. So in one verse you have 4 generations, but it just said it's very, very biblical, this idea of just simply making disciples, baptizing, teaching obedience. I love, some of his joking at the beginning, in that when he's talking about this is not, it's simple, but it's not easy. In fact, for us, it's impossible. we have to be dependent on the Spirit for this to happen, and we have to also realize there are spirits very much against this. And I know that within this series, you're gonna probably hear people say that, Satan is probably okay with us just doing addition growth, because addition growth won't reach the world.
Yeah.
But boy, he is against multiplication.
So what we're envisioning is disciples who make disciples who make disciples who plant churches that make disciples that plant churches. And
Right.
so you've got these multiple streams, at least 100 churches, 4 generations deep. That's amazing stuff.
Right.
Notice what's happening is different than, and the language is different than what North Americans are used to. So
Right.
Jonathan in the chat box asked this question. He says, what do you mean by discipleship as it is used in our current culture? He says, I found discipleship really vague, and which he's absolutely right about that.
Yeah.
Discipleship tends to mean education in North America. Like I'll tell people that, I have the privilege of leading Discipleship.org, and they go, "Oh, I got some curriculum I want to show you."
Right.
And
I'll just tell you that when I was first exposed to Discipleship.org, it was after I had been exposed to disciple making movements, and so I went into it probably. Honestly, I was thinking, this is going to be probably more along the lines of a Western style, that kind of education, knowledge-based discipleship. But I was pleasantly surprised when I went into your definitions.
If you go to the About tab, under or on the Discipleship.org website, there are definitions. I believe it's in the eighth or ninth affirmation. We have very clear definitions, because this is so important that we get this right.
Right.
About what we're talking about.
You don't want to toss out the word disciple, because it is biblical. I know discipleship isn't there, but disciple is. It's not just biblical, but it's crucial, because it's part of our commissioning in making disciples. And so, yes, I know disciple means follower, but you don't want to toss that word out. I think it's important. What you guys have done is, hey, let's get a very healthy, very biblical definition of this, so we all know what we're talking about.
I do a little bit of private mentoring for some church leaders here in America, and one of the first things we try to work with them on is that you got to get your definitions right, because if you don't know what you're aiming for, you're not going to get there. We think the word disciple, getting a good biblical framework for disciple, and again, we have that definition, the definition that we use here at discipleship.org, we just adopted what Jim Putman worked on years ago. And it's a disciple is somebody who's following Jesus, being changed by Jesus, and who's committed to the mission of Jesus. Now, as Ken mentioned, the word discipleship is actually not in the Bible. The word evangelism and the word discipleship are not in the Bible. You can just do a Google search or a search on your Bible app to find that out. Discipleship is a word, it's a made-up word that simply means the state of discipleship. The biblical language is make disciples, and so the idea of disciple making tends to be more biblical language.
Yeah.
And then I want to add an adjective to it, and that's Jesus style disciple making. So when we talk about what we're talking about doing with people what Jesus did with his disciples. Right. So Jesus' method of disciple making is that which we champion.
Yeah, and that doing, it's a very action based. There is in those three things you mentioned, it's that committed to being a part of Christ's mission. That's a being. So there is a being to it, but so much of being a disciple maker is not a brain thing. It's a going out. It's a relationship activity.
Yeah.
And it is a stepping out in faith. It's a believing that God is working on people's hearts. It's a believing that the harvest is plentiful, but the bottleneck is not in the harvest. Even here in the U.S., that's not the bottleneck. The bottleneck is that the workers are few. Who are the workers? The workers are disciple makers, not pew warmers or church members, but active disciple makers.
I'd like to ask you to help us to see, and I'm going to show each of these. I'm going to throw them at you rapidly because I'm conscious of our time here.
Right.
There are barriers that you've mapped out to disciple making movements here in
specifically for this culture.
Yeah, in North America. So I just want you to be brief on each of these. We'll try to do a 1 minute on each, rapid fire. Mm-hmm. So the first barrier that you bring up is time and money. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, and again, just to back up a moment, Ben in the chat, asked, what's it going to take to do this kind of thing or see movements in the U.S.? Do we have to blow up everything and start from scratch? And that's what this series is about, just so you know. But yeah, so there are barriers and they're significant, but with God, all things are possible, right? And I think one of the biggest barriers for us is time. It's a precious resource. We give very little. We fill up our time with so many things that there's very little margin for anything extra. And disciple making takes time because it is relationship based, and relationships don't just happen at the snap of a finger. It takes time, and and so part of the sacrifice, which we'll get to in a moment, is you have to give something up in order to be a disciple maker. In fact, you probably have to give a lot up. And our churches, unfortunately, are great at filling up church members' times with lots of inward focusing things. But disciple making is about going out to the lost.
Okay, the next barrier is prayer and fasting.
Right. And I can't wait to talk to Shadanke, because when you start understanding, when you hear about the movements from David Young, it just seems like boom, 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 boom. These things are happening. And in many ways, they are really fast, but it doesn't just happen out of a vacuum. And it's not because they have this perfect little strategy that will work all the time and work immediately. It's happening because it is so saturated in supernatural prayer, extraordinary amounts of prayer, far more than any of us feel like we have time for. And when we were ministering in Albania, and it just seemed like we were trying to put these into practice, seemed like we were running up against walls. God, through a series of events, really convicted us that we were not praying nearly enough. And we had, by what I think any, especially American believer, would think was a very good, very healthy prayer life. But my wife and I started every morning getting up early and prayer walking for an hour to 2 hours every single day. And we did that for months and months. And suddenly we started seeing things happen that were incredibly obvious answers to prayer. And that was more prayer than we thought we had time for. But when we committed to doing it, we saw God answering. So we have to really believe in prayer, and that prayer matters and that it changes things.
That's good. Okay. Valuing obedience over just knowledge.
Yeah, I'm looking forward. One of our guests will be Roy Moran, who wrote the book Spent Matches. And he's really great at answering that question of how do you balance this idea of the churches we have now and trying to get movements going? But he loves focusing in on this as well, as do I, in that when we think, and we were just dealing with this when we were talking about definitions of discipleship. Typically, discipleship in the Western mind, especially among ministers, Christian leaders, is a knowledge-based thing. It's knowing more. But disciple making and being a disciple is about obedience. You follow Jesus. You are going where he is going. You're doing what he is saying to do. I don't know if you guys have seen the Chosen TV series, but I'm starting to see that in that series of wow, it really was. You know, he told Peter to go get some food for dinner, so he went and got some food. But that level of obedience is still available to us. And David Young mentioned it in that you when you're praying that much, you start hearing from Jesus, and you start hearing. You start being led, and the word becomes alive because you're reading not just to get it in your head, but you're reading it to say, how can I obey it right now? How can I go out and do this right now?
Okay, so just as a placeholder for folks, we talk about obedience-based disciple making. The next, Ken, is valuing community and relationships.